on BBC Two, James Runcie examines how some writers found inspiration during the Blitz. The Culture Show, Wars of the Hearts.
On the 7th of September 1940, a sharp-eyed warden surveyed the London skyline. He spotted miniature silver planes circling round the target area in such perfect formation that they looked like children's toy models at a fair. Britain had been bracing itself for the last 12 months, and now the front line of the Second World War was coming home.
For many, the Blitz was a testing time of sleeplessness, fear and loss. But amidst the bombs and the blackout, the ruins and the rationing, London's literary set would come into its own. With death a constant presence, life became urgent and precious. And in this febrile atmosphere, allegiances would be tested and infidelities begun. It was an absolute gift for a writer in search of new material.
A few loyal members of London's literary set remained in the city to do battle on the home front. They were waiting for the opportunity to prove themselves. What lay on the horizon would be the making of them and would inspire some of their finest work. When war threatened in the late summer of 1939, no one knew what to expect. So people prepared for the worst. Like many Londoners, writer Graham Greene evacuated his wife and children to the countryside. But, ever alert to possible material, he also contacted his publisher, suggesting,
"You might be interested in a book called The First 100 Days, which would be a personal account of conditions in a Bond London."
But all this was a little premature. It would be another year before the bombers arrived.
For those who remained in London, anticipating a battle on the home front, it was a tedious time of watching and waiting. People tried on their gas masks, watched for fires that never started, and nervously eyed the doormat for their call-up papers from the ministry.
And while they waited, London's literati gravitated here to the pubs and drinking clubs of Fitzrovia. In the Wheatsheaf, the Marquis of Granby, the Bricklayer's Arms, you might find yourself rubbing shoulders, not just with Graham Greene, but with fellow author Henry York, with writer and journalist Elizabeth Bowen, with poets Dylan Thomas and Hilda Doolittle, and perhaps Evelyn Waugh if he happened to be in town.
These were the Fitzrovians, the successors to the Bloomsbury Group, the stayers-on in London, people who found the climate of danger almost addictive.
Out of the fug and ferment of this bohemian quarter would come some of the most compelling literary responses to the Blitz. Elizabeth Bowen's The Heat of the Day, Graham Greene's The Ministry of Fear, and Henry York's Court are all inspired by the wartime lives of their creators. Lives that would be turned upside down when the bombing began.
Time, gentlemen, please. Come on, let's have your glasses now.
As daylight faded on the 7th of September 1940, the air raids on London began. With the Thames to guide them and the moon lighting the way, the aerial bombardment continued relentlessly until dawn. London awoke to find the East End in tatters.
Blitz moved the front line from a distant mark on the map into our own streets and gardens. That autumn, the brutality of the Second World War came crashing into people's homes.
As Graham Greene observed,
It happens in the kitchen, on landings, beside washing baskets. It comes to us without us stirring a yard from our own doorsteps to meet it.
as transport links crumbled and maps no longer reflected reality, London ceased to function as one great city, but broke down into a series of small towns.
In this strange, surreal world, even familiar stomping grounds became foreign territory.
In The Ministry of Fear, a spy thriller set in wartime London, Graham Greene describes the morning after a particularly heavy attack.
This was the same route they had taken last night, but it had been elaborately and trivially changed. What a lot of activity there had been in a few hours. The sticking up of notices, the altering of traffic, the getting to know a slightly different London. He noticed the briskness, the cheerfulness on the faces. You got the impression that this was an early hour of a national holiday. It was simply, he supposed, the effect of finding oneself alive.
The Blitz created a strange, suspended moment inside which anything seemed possible. And writer Elizabeth Bowen, observing London from her flat overlooking Regent's Park, sensed something heady in the air that lent itself to romance. It came to be rumoured, she wrote, that everybody in London was in love.
That summer, Bowen began an affair with the Canadian diplomat Charles Ritchie, a relationship her husband conveniently decided to ignore.
Their passionate liaisons would define her wartime experience and help make her name as a writer. The early days of their courtship, played out against these terraces, are recorded in Ritchie's diary.
I went to see Elizabeth this afternoon and found her standing on the balcony of her sitting room that looks out over Regent's Park. The tall, cool room is full of mirrors and flowers and books. She wants to dedicate her next novel to me. I hope she will, and that it will be her best.
The heat of the day is both a eulogy to the strength of a city under siege and an open love letter to Charles Ritchie, to whom she did indeed dedicate the book.
I think she used the phrase that the Blitz almost exonerated people from guilt because of the unusual nature of the times. It's almost like the Blitz gave people license.
What I think she needed was a very big relationship to kind of fuel her imagination, to give her a secret life, if you like. And Charles was immensely socially popular. Everybody wanted Charles at their parties. And he wasn't dead impressed with her when he first saw her. But when he saw her naked, he said she had the most beautiful body he had ever seen, like a Donatello statue, you know, absolutely pure lines, because of course she'd never had children or anything. And for a little while, it was a very passionate affair. I think the war gave it its intensity, because, as she said, there was always the third person in the relationship, which was history, their time. It couldn't have happened except at this time.
They had met each other, at first not very often, throughout that heady autumn of the first London air raids. Never had any season been more felt. One brought the poetic sense of it with the sense of death. Out of the mists of morning, charred by the unmisty glitter, between the last sunset and the first note of the siren, the darkening, glassy tenseness of evening was drawn fine. and you felt more and more called upon to observe the daytime as a pure and curious holiday from fear.
Elizabeth Bowen described the early stages of the war as a kind of lucid abnormality. What do you think she meant? What was it like in London at the time?
How she described it was a thinning of the membrane between the this and the that. And it was the thinning of the membrane between everything, between rich people and poor people, between the living and the dead, and of course between lovers, that relationships grew up very, very fast, that people felt liberated in some sense to do things that they didn't do before, that there was a conspiracy feeling between those people who stayed in London during the war and those who had refugeed themselves to the country. And one of the things she said was that in general it was the wicked who stayed and the good who went away. And of course she wasn't a wicked woman, but you know what she means.
When each new dawn was a gift, a temporary stay of execution, people were determined to seize each precious day. With husbands billeted abroad and wives and children safely ensconced in the countryside, a general feeling of unmarriedness prevailed, and London became a playground for adults who found themselves single all over again. For Graham Greene, whose wife Vivian had been evacuated to Sussex, the combination of danger and sexual freedom was especially alluring. Greene and Vivian had married a decade previously. They produced 2 children, but the relationship soon dwindled into a purely companionate marriage. To escape the claustrophobia of family life, Greene rented a room in Bloomsbury where he could retreat to write. It was perhaps inevitable that on the day war was declared, Greene would glance out of his study window and catch the eye of the landlady's daughter. The passionate relationship that followed was almost inevitable. Greene's ever-roving eye had alighted on Dorothy Glover, described by one of his drinking companions as a person who, in terms of attractiveness, was an absolute non-starter. But what Dorothy lacked in beauty, she more than made up for with an infectious laugh and a redoubtable spirit. A fellow air raid warden, Dorothy became Greene's trusty accomplice on their treacherous nightly patrols. Returning from duty in the early hours, they would fall into bed to make careless love as the bombs rained down outside. But the fact that Greene had fallen for Dorothy Glover did not prevent him from seeking additional pleasures elsewhere. And these stolen liaisons would find their way into his great post-war novel, The End of the Affair.
It was dark and quiet by this time in the streets, though up in the moon the sky moved the blobs and beams of searchlights. You couldn't see faces where the women stood in doorways and at the entrances of the unused shelters. They had to signal with their torches like glowworms. All the way up Sackville Street, the little lights went on and off. A woman flashed on her light and said, "Like to come home with me, dear?"
Graham Greene had always been a thrill seeker. In his youth, he'd added spice to his life by playing Russian roulette. Now, night after night, the Blitz delivered everything he'd always longed for: danger, tribulation, and sex.
The aerial bombing brought the front line of the war home onto British soil. This was a civilian conflict, and one of the most searing responses to the action would not be penned by a soldier abroad, but a spirited intellectual living in central London.
An incident here and there, and rails gone for guns, from your and my old town square.
In 1942, American poet Hilda Doolittle wrote The Walls Do Not Fall, the first of a trilogy of poems written amidst the 50,000 incidents of the London Blitz.
Hilda Doolittle, or HD as she was known to her friends, refused to leave London when the war began. If one has taken joy and comfort from a country, she observed, one does not like to leave it when there's trouble about.
During the Blitz, HD lived a boldly bisexual life in Knightsbridge with her partner Briar and daughter Perdita, who was the result of an affair. The writer's block, which had dogged her throughout the 1930s, would be released by the destruction and terror she witnessed. Unfazed by physical danger, she found herself happier and more creative than she had ever been. Her only fear was that she should not live to bear witness to this, the defining event of her time.
Ruin everywhere. Yet as the fallen roof leaves the sealed room open to the air, so through our desolation, thoughts stir. Inspiration stalks us through gloom.
On the 16th of April 1941, London experienced the most brutal night of the Blitz. Over 1,000 people died, 100,000 homes were destroyed, and scores of firemen fought to prevent the blaze engulfing the city. Henry York had volunteered for the wartime fire service, reasoning that the position was useful but didn't require him to wield a gun. But during the Blitz, he found himself with a front row seat on the action, and the intensity of the experience infuses his wartime novel, Caught.
They saw the whole fury of the conflagration in which they had to play a part. They sat very still beneath the immensity. For, against it, warehouses, small towers, puny steeples seemed alive with sparks from the mile-high pandemonium of flame reflected in the quaking sky.
Henry York was already leading a double life, writing under the pen name Henry Green. During the Blitz, London became a dramatic backdrop against which he played the starring part.
Didn't York in many ways played up to the idea of firemen as heroes, didn't he?
Henry York signed up at the beginning of the war as a fireman, very much wanting to be a hero, and then was very disappointed that the first year of the war there was absolutely nothing. And so old women sort of spat at firemen on buses because they were seen as not quite doing their bit. But then as soon as the Blitz started, firemen once again became the real heroes in London. And he loved the fact that he had 48-hour shifts, and then he'd have a day off in which he'd see all the sort of young girls who he described as dragging on the floor when firemen passed, and take them to clubs and bars and dance away. And girls used to say to each other, "Who are you going out with tonight, darling? Is it someone you'd like to die with?" And if it was Henry York, then you usually would.
The Blitz kind of gave him the opportunity to be this kind of film star on an extraordinary set.
Absolutely, yes. He loved playing roles. He had a whole set of personas. So he was the aristocrat, he was the businessman, he was the aesthete, and then in the Second World War he became a hero, and that was the role he loved most of all.
In a letter to a friend, York observed, "These times are an absolute gift to the writer," and they were. As the air raids continued, the Blitz became a great social leveller. The bombs were undiscerning. Everyone in London was a target. Henry York was the son of a wealthy industrialist, but like the privileged hero of his novel Caught, he found a night on duty in the fire service soon put pay to social difference.
In some fantastic way I'm sure you only get in a war, we were suddenly alone and forced to rely on one another entirely. And after 12 months of bickering, each crew was thrown upon itself, on its own resources. The only thing to do was to keep together.
Most of London's literati came from upper-middle-class stock. But in the rush and tumble of wartime, they found themselves mixing with people from all walks of life. And nowhere was there more equality or more forced intimacy than during the stuffy, sleepless nights spent in London's underground air raid shelters. Elizabeth Bowen revelled in the fact that her fellow wardens were of all types, so different in fact that were it not for the war, they wouldn't have met at all. She detected a new, more egalitarian society. We've almost stopped talking about democracy, she wrote, because for the first time we are a democracy. We're more, we're almost a commune. Meanwhile, Graham Greene turned these uncomfortable nights into a scene for his book, The Ministry of Fear.
All along the walls, the bodies lay too deep, while outside the raid rumbled and receded. An old man snored across the aisle, and at the end of the shelter, two lovers lay on a mattress with their hands and knees touching.
With so much enforced intimacy, a strict code of conduct developed. Lights were out at 10 o'clock sharp, and any snorer could expect a determined dig in the ribs. But in Graham Greene's local shelter, there were complaints about the inappropriate goings-on. An official accompanying the chief warden on one of his nightly visits was disgusted to note a couple locked in an intimate embrace. But that is Mr. Greene, the chief warden explained, one of our finest wardens, and his nice wife. Mr. Greene's nice wife was, of course, his long-term mistress, Dorothy. Towards the end of 1942, the war retreated from the immediate horizon to a distant pinprick on the map, and London, devoid of danger, began to feel worn out and world-weary. The gay abandon of the previous year was spent, but the chaos and rationing remained. On leave from the Marines, Evelyn Waugh described London as crowded and dead, with Claridge's slowly decaying, wine outrageous in price and quality, newspapers always late and usually deficient.
London was losing its buoyancy, and despite the relentlessly upbeat propaganda, people were simply tired of taking it.
To work or think was to ache. In offices, factories, ministries, shops, kitchens, the hot, yellow sands of each afternoon ran out slowly. Fatigue was the one reality. You dared not envisage sleep. Apathetic, the injured and dying in the hospitals watched light change on walls which might fall tonight.
For Elizabeth Bowen, this change of mood coincided with a cooling off in her affair with Charles Ritchie. Following an afternoon in Kew Gardens, Ritchie confessed in his diary, "I'm in love with Elizabeth imaginatively." It was becoming clear to both of them that her feelings went much deeper than his.
He said at one point he wanted a bit more salt in the relationship.
He was a mover alonger as far as ladies were concerned, and he stopped desiring her, and it never did become institutionalised, that love affair, because they never could live together, and they never did live together, and it was always a question of secret meetings and hurried meetings.
How much do you think this relationship found its way into her writing?
Hugely. I think she needed it in order to write. Put it that way round. She said, "I am a writer before I am a woman." However bad the things that happened to her, it could be fed into her writing. She needed intensity of life in order to write. But the writing was was what it was all for, in a kind of way.
The months before the declaration of peace were as strange as the last days before the outbreak of war. Elizabeth Bowen observed a general paralysis and apprehension, the reverse equivalent of trying on gas masks, which had so pleasantly filled so many hours in 1939. And American poet Hilda Doolittle found herself
sick to death of tensions and tiredness and distress and distorted values, and the high-pitched level and the fortitude which we had proved beyond doubt that we possessed. I had passed the flame. I had had my initiation. I was tired of all that.
In the closing months of the war, H.D. suffered a mental collapse, during which she scaled the roof of her flat, flung her clothes to the ground, and had to be restrained from throwing herself off too. She would suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder for most of her adult life. But like so many of London's literary set, H.D. had survived the war only by writing about it. On the 27th of March 1945, London was hit by the last bomb of the conflict.
Lying in bed that morning, Graham Greene heard a huge crash followed by a terrific rumble and the sound of glass going. He went outside to survey the damage. "It really looks as if the war might be over soon," he wrote to his mother. "One doesn't feel one will have much energy left for peace."
For Elizabeth Bowen, the days following the declaration of peace were great and beautiful. The whole city seemed to leave the ground.
Everyone wore a curious limpidity of expression, like newborn babies or souls just after death. Dazed, but curiously dignified.
But after the initial euphoria, a sense of deflation descended. London had grown used to trials and tribulations, fleetingness and uncertainty, the intense highs and lows of wartime. Without these, life seemed flat. Elizabeth Bowen was forced to watch wistfully as her lifelong love, Charles Ritchie, returned to his native Canada and married his cousin. While Graham Greene and Henry York found that with the return of their wives and children, their extramarital escapades became a little more problematic.
This group of writers who lived and wrote in London during the Blitz were all seeking something that lay forever around the next corner, in the next bar, in the warmth of another person's bed. And for a moment, they found it, only to have it snatched away again when the final all clear sounded. Elizabeth Bowen spoke for them all when she wrote, "I would not have missed being in London during the war for anything. It was the most interesting period of my life."
The war had been a period of incredible and unsustainable intensity. These writers would never live as vibrantly again, except, of course, in print.
Blue skies smiling at me.
It was a war between two different ways of life, a war of ideas, a war of shadows,
But blue skies from now
a war of the imagination.
Strange Days, part of the Cold War season, Tuesday at 9 on BBC2.
Planet Earth, it's unique. It has life. To understand why, we're going to build a planet up there.
These were the objects that were making the Earth.
We're now weightless. That's how our planet started.
The arms are a little bit long so that the smallest they go.
This is like every shopping trip I've ever been on.
Richard Hammond Builds a Universe. Sunday at 9 on BBC One and BBC One HD.
If you missed the artist Grayson Perry's acclaimed Wreath lectures, catch up online at the BBC Radio 4 website, along with every other Wreath lecture from 1948 onwards.
The latest thing happening here is that President Morsi is addressing the nation right now. He is not going to resign.
Whatever the outcome, there are going to be a lot of very angry people on the streets.
Quote, a full military coup is underway.
What is confirmed is that over the past few minutes, army tanks have started deploying.
The democratic experiment here, for now anyway, is ending.
President Morsi has been toppled from power.
We've been waiting for this moment.
But very big question marks looming over the future of democracy in this country.
The BBC News Channel. Breaking news, developing stories.